Hello everyone. Welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the frozen wastelands of Alaska with 8 bone-chilling accounts from those who dared to explore the last frontier's most desolate ghost towns. In this episode, we will journey through abandoned mining settlements and forgotten frontier communities with harrowing tales of supernatural encounters adapted from genuine reports submitted by witnesses across the state. Each story has been meticulously compiled from first-hand testimonies of individuals who claim to have experienced the unexplainable. In these isolated settlements, where the boundary between the living and the dead grows dangerously thin. From phantom miners still working their claims to spectral children echoing through empty schoolhouses. These accounts reveal that some places refuse to remain buried in the past. To preserve the safety and privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, certain names and specific locations have been modified. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for spine-tingling true horror content that explores the darkest corners of forgotten America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of terrifying tales. Now settle in as we begin our descent into Alaska's most haunted ghost towns. I have been inspecting abandoned mines across Alaska for 6 years now. And in that time, I have seen things that would make most people reconsider their career choices. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work as a mine safety inspector for the state. It is not glamorous work, but someone has to ensure these old shafts do not become death traps for curious explorers or local kids looking for adventure. Most of the time, it is routine inspections, checking for cave-ins, toxic gases, and structural integrity. But what happened at the old Kennecott mine changed everything I thought I knew about my job. It was late October 2023 when I received an urgent call from my supervisor. There had been reports of strange lights and sounds coming from the abandoned Kennecott copper mine, and the local authorities wanted an official inspection before the winter weather made access impossible. Kennecott is one of Alaska's most famous ghost towns, nestled in the Wrangell Mountains about 5 hours northeast of Anchorage. The mine operated from 1911 to 1938, extracting millions of dollars worth of copper ore before the deposits were exhausted and the company pulled out, leaving behind an entire town frozen in time. I had been to Kennecott twice before for routine inspections, always during daylight hours with a full crew. This time was different. The reports were coming in during the night shift hours, specifically between midnight and 3 in the morning. So I would need to conduct a nocturnal investigation to properly assess what people were seeing. My supervisor assigned me a partner, a young geologist named Marcus Chen, fresh out of college and eager to prove himself. Looking back, I wish I had insisted on going alone. We arrived at Kennecott just after 11 at night, driving the last 20 miles on a dirt road that had not seen maintenance since the 1940s. The ghost town sits at the base of massive mountain peaks, and even with a full moon, the shadows cast by those towering ridges made the entire settlement feel like it was drowning in darkness. The main buildings still stand. The massive mill, the general store, the hospital, and rows of worker housing that once sheltered hundreds of miners and their families. During the day, tourists sometimes visit to take photographs and learn about Alaska's mining history. At night, it feels like stepping into another world entirely. We parked near the mill building and began unloading our equipment. Standard safety gear included gas detectors, structural assessment tools, powerful LED floodlights, and emergency communication devices. Marcus was nervous. I could tell by the way he kept checking and rechecking his equipment. He had read the reports about the strange lights and sounds, and his imagination was clearly getting the better of him. I tried to reassure him that we would probably find nothing more than some loose electrical wiring causing intermittent power fluctuations, or maybe animals that had made their way into the buildings. The Kennecott mine consists of multiple levels, with the main entrance leading into a network of tunnels that stretch deep into the mountainside. The original mining operation had been incredibly sophisticated for its time, with electric lighting, ventilation systems, and even a power plant to keep everything running. When the company abandoned the site, they left most of the infrastructure in place. Though decades of Alaska winters had taken their toll on the equipment, we entered through the main shaft at exactly midnight, our headlamps cutting through the absolute darkness that filled the tunnels. The temperature inside was a constant 38 degrees, cold enough to see our breath, but not quite freezing. Our footsteps echoed off the rock walls as we made our way deeper into the mine, following the main corridor toward the areas where the lights had been reported. About 300 yards into the tunnel system, we reached the first checkpoint. This was where the original miners would have gathered for shift changes, a large circular chamber with multiple tunnel entrances branching off in different directions. I was setting up my gas detection equipment when Marcus grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. At first, there was nothing but the typical sounds you would expect in an abandoned mine. Water dripping somewhere in the distance, the occasional groan of settling timber supports, and the whistle of air moving through the ventilation shafts. But then I heard it too. A rhythmic clanging sound, metal on metal, coming from somewhere deeper in the mine. Probably just thermal expansion, I told Marcus, though I was not entirely convinced myself. Metal contracts and expands with temperature changes. These old support beams have been doing it for decades. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful to be random thermal movement. It had a pattern to it, like someone hammering or operating machinery. We decided to investigate, following the sound deeper into the mine complex. The clanging led us down a side tunnel I had never explored during my previous inspections. This passage was narrower than the main corridors, with rough-hewn walls that showed the marks of hand tools rather than modern excavation equipment. The original miners must have dug this section manually, probably chasing a particularly rich vein of copper ore. Our headlamps revealed support timbers that looked ancient and potentially unstable, but my structural readings showed they were still sound. As we moved deeper into the tunnel, the clanging sound grew louder and more distinct. It was definitely metallic, and it was definitely rhythmic. But there was something else underneath it now. Voices. Human voices, speaking in low tones that I could not quite make out. Marcus heard them too, because he stopped walking and turned to look at me with wide eyes. "There is someone else down here," he said, stating the obvious. My first thought was that we had stumbled across trespassers, maybe urban explorers or treasure hunters looking for artifacts to steal. It would not be the first time someone had broken into an abandoned mine site. But as we got closer to the source of the sounds, I realized something was wrong. The voices were not speaking English or any language I could identify. They had an odd, hollow quality to them, like they were coming from very far away or through some kind of audio distortion. We rounded a bend in the tunnel and found ourselves at the entrance to a large underground chamber. This was clearly one of the original mining areas, with overhead tracks still in place for the ore cars and evidence of extensive excavation work. But what stopped us in our tracks was what we saw inside the chamber. There were lights, not electric lights, but the warm, flickering glow of oil lamps and lanterns, and silhouettes, human figures moving around the chamber, carrying tools and equipment, working at what appeared to be an active mining operation. The clanging sound was coming from their pickaxes and shovels as they worked the rock face, and the voices were the miners calling instructions to each other. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. My rational mind insisted that this had to be some kind of elaborate hoax or maybe a historical reenactment that we had not been told about. But something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong. The lighting was too dim and inconsistent, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The figures themselves appeared translucent, like they were made of smoke or mist rather than solid matter. Marcus was gripping my arm so tightly I could feel his fingers through my heavy jacket. He was trembling, whether from cold or fear I could not tell. I reached for my radio to contact our supervisor, but when I tried to key the microphone, all I got was static. We were too deep underground for normal radio communication, but my equipment should have been able to reach the repeater we had set up outside. Something was interfering with the signal. One of the figures in the chamber turned toward us, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was the face of a man in his 40s, with a thick mustache and deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal light. He was wearing the kind of work clothes that miners would have worn in the 1920s. Heavy canvas pants, a wool shirt, and a leather cap with a carbide lamp attached to the front. But the most disturbing thing about him was that I could see through him. He was there, but he was not there. Like a photograph double exposed on the same piece of film. The miner looked directly at me and smiled, raising his hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. Then he turned back to work, driving his pickaxe into the rock face with mechanical precision. The other figures continued their activities as if we were not there at all, loading ore into cars, reinforcing tunnel supports, and calling out to each other in that strange, echoing language. I do not know how long we stood there watching this impossible scene. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to move differently in that chamber, like we had stepped outside the normal flow of reality. But eventually, Marcus tugged on my sleeve and pointed toward the tunnel entrance. His meaning was clear. We needed to leave, and we needed to leave now. We backed away from the chamber as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb whatever we had witnessed. Once we were around the bend and out of sight of the mining operation, we moved as quickly as we could through the tunnels toward the surface. Neither of us spoke during the retreat. We were both too shaken by what we had seen to put it into words. When we finally emerged from the mine entrance, the first light of dawn was beginning to show over the mountain peaks. We had been underground for over 6 hours, though it had felt like much less time. We packed our equipment in silence and drove back toward the anchorage without discussing what had happened. It was not until we were back at the office the next day that Marcus finally asked me what I thought we had seen. I told him the truth. I had no idea. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under scrutiny. There had been no active mining operation at Kennecott since 1938. There were no reenactment groups scheduled to use the site. The figures we had seen were translucent and spoke in a language that did not match any of the ethnic groups that had worked the mine during its operational years. I filed my official report as a routine inspection with no significant findings. I could not bring myself to document what we had actually witnessed because I knew no one would believe it. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night, and I have done extensive research into the history of the Kennecott mine. What I discovered disturbs me more than the ghostly miners themselves. According to historical records, there were several fatal accidents during the mine's operational years. Cave-ins gas explosions, and equipment failures claimed the lives of at least 37 workers between 1911 and 1938. Many of these men were buried in unmarked graves near the mine site because their families could not afford to transport the bodies back to their home states. I believe we witnessed the midnight shift that never ended. Miners who died in those tunnels and continue their work in death as they did in life. They are trapped in that underground world, forever extracting copper ore that no longer exists from rock faces that played out decades ago. I have not returned to Kennecott since that night, and I have requested that my supervisor assign that site to other inspectors. Mark is transferred to a different department within 6 months and now works exclusively on surface-level projects. We have never discussed that night again, but sometimes I catch him looking at me across the office with the same haunted expression I see in my own mirror. The reports of lights and sounds at Kennecott continue to come in, always during the midnight hours, always from people who claim to have seen things that should not exist. I know now that they are telling the truth, and I know that somewhere deep in those mountain tunnels, the midnight shift continues its eternal work. Antique hunting in ghost towns is not just my hobby. It pays the bills and feeds my soul in a way that few people understand. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and for the past 8 years, I have been traveling across Alaska, searching through abandoned buildings for forgotten treasures that tell the stories of people who lived and died in this unforgiving wilderness. Most folks think I am crazy for spending weeks at a time in these desolate places. But there is something magical about finding a piece of history that no one else thought was worth saving. I run a small antique shop in Anchorage called Forgotten Alaska, and my customers range from serious collectors to tourists looking for authentic frontier memorabilia. The real money comes from the rare finds. Original mining equipment, native Alaskan artifacts sold with proper documentation, and vintage clothing from the gold rush era. Women's clothing from the early 1900s is particularly valuable because so few pieces survived the harsh conditions and practical necessities of frontier life. That is why I was so excited when I heard about the untouched buildings in Dia, a ghost town near Skagway that most people have never even heard of. Dia was a boom town during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, serving as a starting point for prospectors heading over the Chilkoot Pass. At its peak, the town had over 8,000 residents, dozens of businesses, and all the trappings of a thriving frontier community. But when the railroad reached Skagway in 1900, Dia was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind an entire town frozen in time. I had received a tip from another dealer that there was a general store in Deya that still contained original merchandise from the 1890s. The building had been locked up tight when the last owner left, and harsh weather had kept most treasure hunters away. Getting there required a combination of driving and hiking that would take the better part of a day, but the potential payoff was worth the effort. I set out on a clear September morning in 2023, driving the Alaska Highway north toward the Canadian border before turning west toward Skagway. The final approach to Dia required leaving the main road and following an old mining trail that tested the limits of my four-wheel drive truck. The ghost town sits in a valley surrounded by towering peaks, accessible only during the brief summer and fall months when the passes are clear of snow. Dia today consists of scattered building foundations, a few partially standing structures, and the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling pier extending into the Lynn Canal. Most of the original buildings had collapsed decades ago, but I could see the general store my contact had described standing at what would have been the center of town. It was a 2-story wooden structure with weathered siding and a peaked roof that had somehow survived more than a century of Alaska winters. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that had long since rusted solid. but I found a loose board on the back wall that allowed me to squeeze inside. The moment I stepped through that opening, I knew I had found something special. The building still smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through cracked windows. The main floor had been the retail space, with wooden shelves lining the walls and a long counter running down the center of the room. Most of the merchandise had been cleared out when the store closed, but I could see remnants of the original inventory. Rusted tools, empty bottles, and bolts of fabric that had survived because they were stored in sealed containers. But it was the second floor that took my breath away. This had been the proprietor's living quarters, and it looked like the family had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. There was furniture from the 1890s, personal photographs, books, and clothing still hanging in a wooden armoire. This was exactly the kind of untouched find that antique dealers dream about. I spent the first few hours carefully cataloging what I could see, taking photographs and making notes about the most valuable pieces. There was a dining set that would easily bring $5,000, several oil paintings that appeared to be original works, and what looked like a complete set of china from a prestigious manufacturer back east. But it was while I was examining the china that I noticed something else. A white garment hanging in the back corner of the armoire, partially hidden behind other clothing. When I carefully moved the other pieces aside, I found myself looking at the most beautiful wedding dress I had ever seen. It was made of ivory silk with intricate beadwork and lace detailing that would have required hundreds of hours of hand-stitching. The style was typical of the 1890s, with a fitted bodice, full skirt, and a train that would have extended several feet behind the bride. But what made this dress truly remarkable was its condition. Despite being over 120 years old, it looked like it had been made yesterday. The silk had not yellowed or deteriorated. The beadwork was intact, and there was not a single stain or tear anywhere on the garment. I had handled enough vintage clothing to know that this level of preservation was virtually impossible. Silk fabric from that era should have been brittle and discolored after more than a century, especially in Alaska's extreme climate variations. Yet this dress looked ready to be worn to a wedding tomorrow. As I lifted the dress from the armoire to examine it more closely, I noticed something else unusual. Despite the size of the garment, it seemed to weigh almost nothing, as if it were made of air rather than fabric. And when I held it up to the window to look at the beadwork, I could have sworn I saw the dress move slightly, as if there were a gentle breeze in the room, though all the windows were closed and there was no air circulation. I decided to take the dress back to Anchorage for proper evaluation and potential sale. A wedding dress from the Klondike era in this condition would be worth at least $20,000 to the right collector. I carefully wrapped it in acid-free tissue paper and placed it in a specialized garment box designed for transporting vintage clothing. The drive back to Anchorage was uneventful, but I found myself thinking about the dress throughout the journey. There was something about finding it that felt different from my other discoveries. Usually when I find a valuable antique, I feel a sense of satisfaction and excitement about the potential profit. With this dress, I felt something else. An odd sense of responsibility, as if I were being trusted with something precious rather than simply acquiring merchandise for my shop. I arrived home late that evening and carefully transported the dress box to my workshop, where I had proper equipment for examining and restoring vintage textiles. I planned to spend the next few days researching the dress's origins and preparing it for sale. But first, I wanted to take some detailed photographs for my records. When I opened the garment box and unwrapped the tissue paper, the dress looked exactly as it had in Dia. Perfect condition, pristine white silk, and intricate beadwork that caught the light from my photography lamps. I set up my camera equipment and began taking detailed shots of the bodice, sleeves, and skirt. It was while I was photographing the train of the dress that I first saw her. In the viewfinder of my camera, standing behind the dress, was a young woman in her early 20s with dark hair arranged in the elaborate style typical of the 1890s. She was beautiful, with delicate features and large eyes that seemed to be looking directly at me through the camera lens. But when I lowered the camera to look at the dress directly, there was no one there. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light or a reflection from one of my photography lamps. But when I raised the camera again, she was still there. This time she appeared to be reaching toward the dress with one hand, as if she were trying to touch it. I set the camera down and stepped back from the dress, my heart racing. I have been around antiques my entire adult life, and I have heard all the stories about objects carrying the energy or memories of their previous owners. I had always dismissed such tales as superstition, but I could not explain what I was seeing through my camera. Over the next several days, the incidents escalated. Every time I tried to work with the dress, whether to examine it more closely or take additional photographs, I would see the young woman. Sometimes she appeared as a reflection in mirrors or windows. Other times I would catch glimpses of her in my peripheral vision, standing in the corner of my workshop or walking past the doorway. But it was not just visual appearances. The dress itself began to behave strangely. I would position it one way for photography and return the next morning to find it arranged differently, as if someone had been handling it overnight. The silk fabric, which should have been cool to the touch, sometimes felt warm when I handled it, as if it had been recently worn. I tried researching the history of the Daiya General Store and its owners, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. What I discovered made the situation even more disturbing. The store had been owned by a family named Patterson, who had arrived in Daiya in 1897 during the height of the gold rush. Thomas Patterson ran the store while his wife Margaret took care of their daughter Sarah, who was 19 years old when they arrived in Alaska. According to the records I found, Sarah Patterson had been engaged to marry a prospector named William Hayes in the spring of 1899, but the wedding never took place. William Hayes died in an avalanche while attempting to cross Chilkoot Pass in March of 1899, just 2 months before the planned ceremony. Sarah Patterson died of pneumonia that same winter, and her parents abandoned Decia the following summer, unable to bear the memories associated with the town. The dress I had found was Sarah Patterson's wedding dress, never worn and never removed from the armoire, where it had waited for more than 120 years. As I learned more about Sarah's story, the paranormal activity in my workshop intensified. I would arrive in the morning to find old photographs scattered around the dress, as if someone had been looking through them during the night. My equipment would be moved or turned off, and sometimes I would hear what sounded like quiet sobbing coming from the corner where I kept the dress. The final incident happened 3 weeks after I brought the dress home from Daiya. I had been working late in my shop, trying to complete the documentation necessary to sell the dress to a collector in Seattle. It was nearly midnight when I heard music coming from my workshop. Soft, melodic music that sounded like a music box or a player piano. When I went to investigate, I found the dress floating 3 feet off the ground, swaying gently as if someone were wearing it and dancing to the distant music. The young woman I had seen in my photographs was now fully visible, translucent but clearly present, wearing the dress and moving in a waltz pattern around my workshop. She saw me watching and stopped dancing, turning to face me with an expression of infinite sadness. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I never got to wear it," she said. "I never got to dance at my wedding." I stood there frozen, unable to move or speak, as Sarah Patterson continued to dance in her wedding dress to music only she could hear. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she gradually faded away, and the dress settled gently onto my workbench. The next morning, I carefully packed the wedding dress back into its garment box and drove it back to Daya. I returned it to the armoire where I had found it, arranging it exactly as it had been when I first discovered it. As I was leaving the abandoned store, I could swear I heard a woman's voice saying, "Thank you," carried on the wind. I never went back to that building, and I've never told anyone else about what I experienced with Sarah Patterson's wedding dress. Some objects are not meant to be bought and sold. Some treasures are meant to remain where they are, keeping their secrets and their sorrows in the places where they belong. The dress is still there in Daya, waiting in the armoire of an abandoned general store, as beautiful and perfect as the day it was made. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, locals say you can hear waltz music drifting through the ruins of the old town, as if someone is finally having the wedding dance that never was. Growing up, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old railroad days, back when the Alaska Railroad was the lifeline connecting remote communities to the rest of the world. He worked as a conductor for 37 years, riding those rails through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain on Earth. My name is Marcus Washington, and I am 24 years old. Unlike my grandfather, I never worked for the railroad professionally, but trains have been my passion since childhood. I collect vintage railroad memorabilia, study historical routes, and spend my weekends exploring abandoned rail lines across Alaska. That passion is what brought me to McCarthy in October 2023. McCarthy is a tiny community that sits at the end of one of the most remote railroad spurs ever built in Alaska. The Copper River and Northwestern Railway constructed the line in the early 1910s to transport copper ore from the Kennecott mines to the port in Cordova. When the mines closed in 1938, the railroad was abandoned, leaving behind nearly 200 miles of track, bridges, and tunnel infrastructure that slowly disappeared back into the wilderness. Most of the original rail line has been reclaimed by nature or dismantled for scrap metal. But some sections near McCarthy still show evidence of the engineering marvel that once carried millions of tons of ore through seemingly impossible mountain terrain. I had been planning this trip for months, hoping to photograph the remaining trestles and document what was left of the roadbed before winter made access impossible. I arrived in McCarthy on a gray Thursday afternoon, driving the notoriously difficult McCarthy Road that follows roughly the same route the railroad once took. The road is 60 miles of potholes, washouts, and single-lane bridges that test both your vehicle and your nerve. McCarthy itself has maybe 25 year-round residents, most of whom make their living from the handful of tourists who visit during the summer months. I had arranged to stay at a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Rose Delano, whose family had lived in the area since the railroad days. Rose was in her 70s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that come from decades of Alaska living. She seemed pleased to have a guest interested in local railroad history. And over dinner that first night, she shared stories about the old days when the train would arrive twice a week, carrying supplies, mail, and passengers. My father worked for the railroad, she told me as we sat in her kitchen drinking coffee. He was a section foreman, responsible for maintaining about 10 miles of track through some of the worst country you can imagine. He used to say that railroad was built more on determination than engineering sense. Rose warned me about exploring the old rail line alone, especially during the short October days when darkness came early and weather could change without warning. But she also understood the fascination with railroad history and agreed to let me borrow an old trail map that showed where the most accessible sections of track remained. The next morning, I set out with my camera equipment, hiking boots, and enough supplies for a full day of exploration. The section I planned to document was about 3 miles from town, where the railroad had crossed a deep gorge on a timber trestle bridge. According to my research, portions of that bridge were still standing, though the rails themselves had been removed decades ago. The hike to the bridge site took me through dense forest and over rough terrain that showed no signs of recent human passage. The original roadbed was still visible in places, marked by the distinctive grading and drainage ditches that railroad crews had carved through the wilderness more than a century ago. As I walked, I tried to imagine what it must have been like for those early workers, building a railroad through country that seemed determined to reject human intrusion. I reached the gorge around noon and found the remains of the trestle bridge exactly where my map indicated. It was an impressive sight, even in its deteriorated condition. The original structure had been built from massive timber beams, some of them 3 feet thick, arranged in the complex geometric patterns typical of early 20th century railroad engineering. About half of the bridge was still standing, though it was clearly unsafe for crossing. The missing sections had fallen into the gorge below, where I could see the twisted remains of wooden beams and iron hardware scattered among the rocks. I spent several hours photographing the bridge from different angles, documenting the construction techniques and hardware that would have been state-of-the-art when the line was built. The afternoon was quiet, except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of ravens. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, isolated experience I had been hoping for. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, I started packing up my equipment for the hike back to town. The October days were short, and I wanted to be off the trail before full darkness set in. That was when I heard it for the first time. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the forest. At first, I thought it might be a helicopter or small aircraft. But the sound was wrong for that. It was more mechanical, more regular, like the steady chuffing of a steam engine working hard to pull a heavy load up a steep grade. I stopped packing and listened more carefully, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. The sound grew louder and more distinct, and I realized with a chill that it was coming from the direction of the abandoned railroad line. Not just the general direction, but specifically from the tracks themselves, as if a train were approaching the bridge where I stood. I told myself it had to be some kind of industrial equipment, maybe a maintenance crew working on the road system or a mining operation I had not heard about. But as the sound continued to grow louder, I began to make out other noises underneath the main engine sound. The rhythmic clicking of wheels on rails, the squeal of metal brake shoes, and what sounded like the sharp blast of a steam whistle echoing off the mountain walls. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was impossible. There had been no active railroad traffic through this area since 1938. The rails had been removed, the bridges were unsafe, and there was no conceivable reason for any kind of train to be operating on this abandoned line. But my ears were telling me a different story. I grabbed my camera and positioned myself where I would have a clear view of the bridge approach, thinking that whatever was making this sound would have to come into sight within the next few minutes. The mechanical noises were now loud enough that I could distinguish individual components. The heavy breathing of a steam locomotive, the clatter of multiple cars following behind the engine, and voices calling out in what sounded like working commands. That was when I saw the headlight. A single bright beam cut through the forest darkness, moving along the exact path where the railroad tracks had once been. Behind the light, I could make out the dark bulk of a steam locomotive, its smokestack visible against the evening sky. The engine was pulling what appeared to be a long train of freight cars, all of them loaded with what looked like copper ore from the Kennecott mines. I raised my camera and started taking pictures, though my hands were shaking so badly I was not sure any of them would be in focus. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that should not have been possible. The locomotive was a narrow-gauge engine typical of the early 1900s, painted in the dark green livery of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. I could see figures in the cab, men wearing the kind of work clothes that railroad crews would have worn during the original operation of the line. The train approached the broken bridge at what seemed like normal operating speed, showing no signs of slowing down or stopping. I wanted to shout a warning, to somehow alert the crew that the bridge was unsafe, but no sound would come from my throat. I could only stand there and watch as the locomotive reached the edge of the intact portion of the trestle. What happened next defied every law of physics I understood. Instead of plunging into the gorge where the bridge was broken, the train continued across empty air, following the path where the missing rails should have been. I could see it clearly. A full locomotive and string of ore cars crossing a gap of more than 100 feet, supported by nothing but thin mountain air. The phantom train completed its impossible crossing and disappeared into the forest on the other side of the gorge, the sound of its engine gradually fading into the distance. Within minutes, the mechanical noises were gone entirely, leaving only the natural sounds of wind and wildlife that had been there before. I stood at the edge of the broken bridge for a long time, staring across the gorge and trying to process what I had witnessed. When I finally looked at my camera to review the photographs I had taken, every single image showed nothing but empty forest and the broken remains of the trestle bridge. Whatever I had seen and heard had left no trace on the digital sensor. The hike back to McCarthy in the gathering darkness was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every sound in the forest made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the headlight of the phantom train bearing down on me from behind. By the time I reached Rose's bed and breakfast, my nerves were completely shattered. Rose took one look at me and immediately made a pot of strong coffee, settling me down at her kitchen table while I tried to explain what had happened. She listened to my story without interruption, nodding occasionally, but showing no signs of surprise or disbelief. When I finished, Rose was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I could not quite read. "You are not the first person to see that train," she said quietly. "My father saw it 3 times during his years working the section. Always in the evening, always crossing that same bridge. He said it was the spirits of the men who died building the railroad, still trying to complete their run to Cordova." She went to an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1923. The headline read, "Train Derailment Claims 6 Lives Near McCarthy." According to the article, a locomotive and 4 ore cars had plunged off the trestle bridge during a winter storm, killing the entire crew. Their bodies were never recovered from the bottom of the gorge. "Every few years, someone sees them," Rose continued. "Always the same train, always crossing the broken bridge, always heading toward Cordova with a load of copper ore. My father used to say they will keep making that run until someone fixes the bridge and lets them complete their journey." I left McCarthy the next morning, cutting my planned week-long visit short. I have not been back since, and I have no plans to return. Sometimes, late at night when I hear the distant whistle of a modern freight train, I think about those phantom railroad men, forever trapped on their endless run through the Alaska wilderness. The photographs I took that day show nothing unusual, just the broken remains of an old trestle bridge in a remote mountain gorge. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Somewhere in the forests around McCarthy, the last train is still running, carrying its ghostly crew and phantom cargo on a journey that will never end. As a substitute teacher, I have worked in some pretty remote places across Alaska, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the abandoned schoolhouse at Chitina. My name is Emma Thompson, and I am 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I have been traveling between small communities throughout the state, filling in wherever certified teachers are needed. The work is challenging but rewarding, especially when you get to see children in isolated areas receive the education they deserve. Most of the communities I visit are still active, with functioning schools and eager students. But occasionally, I encounter places where the schools have been abandoned for decades, victims of economic decline or population shifts that left entire towns empty. Chitina falls into this category. Once a thriving railroad town with over 1,000 residents, it now has fewer than 50 year-round inhabitants, most of whom are elderly or running tourism-related businesses during the brief summer season. I came to Chitina in late September 2023 not to teach, but to research a paper I was writing about rural education in Alaska for my master's degree program. The town's old schoolhouse, built in 1915, was supposed to be an excellent example of early 20th century frontier architecture adapted for educational purposes. I had received permission from the town council to photograph and document the building, with the understanding that I would share my research with the local historical society. The schoolhouse sits on a small hill overlooking what remains of Chitina's main street. It is a 2-story wooden structure with tall windows designed to maximize natural light during Alaska's dark winter months. The building served the community from 1915 until 1987, when declining enrollment forced the consolidation of classes with a school in nearby Glen Allen. Since then, it had been locked up and largely forgotten, slowly deteriorating in the harsh climate. I arrived in Chitina on a gray afternoon that threatened rain, driving the 70-mile gravel road from the Richardson Highway. The town felt almost deserted, with most of the buildings showing signs of abandonment or minimal maintenance. The few residents I encountered were friendly, but seemed surprised that anyone would be interested in the old schoolhouse. The building's caretaker was a man named Robert Steinberg, who had been a student there in the 1960s and later served on the school board when it closed. He was in his 70s, with thick gray hair and the kind of calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Robert seemed genuinely pleased that someone wanted to document the school's history, and he spent nearly an hour telling me stories about teachers and students from decades past. "That place has a lot of memories," he said as he handed me the keys to the front door. "Some good, some not so good. The winters were hard on everyone, especially the children who had to walk miles to get to school. We lost a few students over the years to accidents and illness, but the school kept going until there just weren't enough kids left to justify keeping it open. Robert warned me that the building's electrical system had been disconnected years ago, so I would need to bring my own lighting equipment. He also mentioned that some of the floorboards on the second floor were potentially unsafe, advising me to stay on the main floor if possible. With those cautions in mind, I thanked him for his time and headed up the hill to begin my documentation work. The front door of the schoolhouse opened with a loud creak that echoed through the empty building. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood and paper that had been sitting undisturbed for decades. The main floor consisted of two large classrooms, a small office that had served as the principal's workspace, and a narrow hallway that connected to the staircase leading to the second floor. Both classrooms retained much of their original equipment. Wooden desks arranged in rows, a large blackboard at the front of each room, and educational posters that had faded with age but were still partially readable. In one classroom, I found a globe that must have dated to the 1950s, showing countries and borders that no longer existed. The other room had a piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age and several strings broken. I spent the first few hours taking photographs and making detailed notes about the architectural features and educational equipment. The building was a remarkable time capsule, preserving not just the physical structure, but also the atmosphere of a frontier school where children had learned to read and write in one of America's most challenging environments. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore the second floor despite Robert's warnings about the floorboards. I tested each step carefully as I climbed the narrow staircase and found that while some boards were soft with age, the structure seemed fundamentally sound. The second floor had originally been designed as an auditorium and assembly space, with a small stage at one end and rows of wooden benches facing toward it. It was while I was photographing the stage area that I first heard the school bell. The sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze tone of a large school bell ringing in the measured pattern that would have called students to class or dismissed them for recess. But according to Robert, the bell had been removed from the building years ago and donated to a museum in Anchorage. I looked around for any obvious source of the sound, but the bell tower I could see from outside was clearly empty. I told myself it must have been some kind of acoustic phenomenon, maybe wind blowing through the empty bell tower in a way that created sound. But as I continued working, the bell rang again, this time in a different pattern. 3 short rings, followed by 2 long ones. That was the traditional signal for the end of the school day, a pattern that would have been used thousands of times during the building's 72 years of operation. The third time I heard the bell, it was accompanied by other sounds. The scraping of chairs against wooden floors, the rustle of papers being gathered, and what sounded like children's voices talking excitedly as they prepared to leave for the day. The sounds were coming from the main floor classrooms directly below me. I made my way back down the staircase as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening below. When I reached the hallway, I could hear the sounds more clearly. Children were definitely talking, their voices high and animated in the way that kids sound when they are excited about something. I could make out individual words occasionally: homework, recess, and Miss Anderson. I approached the first classroom and peered around the door frame. What I saw made no rational sense, but I could not deny the evidence of my own eyes. The classroom was full of children, perhaps 20 or 25 students ranging in age from about 6 to 14. They were dressed in clothing from what appeared to be the 1940s or 1950s. Simple dresses for the girls, knickers and suspenders for the boys, and practical shoes suitable for walking long distances in rough country. At the front of the classroom stood a woman in her 30s, wearing a long skirt and white blouse typical of mid-20th century fashion. Her dark hair was pinned back in a style that matched the period of the children's clothing. She was writing something on the blackboard, and I could see that her handwriting was the kind of careful script that teachers of that era would have drilled into their students. The children appeared solid and real, not translucent or ghostly in any obvious way. They were gathering their books and papers, putting on coats and hats, and chatting with each other about typical school-age concerns. But there was something subtly wrong about the scene that I could not initially identify. It took me several minutes of observation to realize what was bothering me. The children cast no shadows. Despite the bright afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, none of the figures in the classroom produced the dark silhouettes that living people would create. They were there, but they were not entirely there, existing in some state between reality and memory. The teacher at the front of the room looked up from the blackboard and made eye contact with me. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile that suggested she was genuinely fond of her students. When she spoke, her voice had the clear, carrying quality that good teachers develop from years of addressing classrooms full of children. "Class is dismissed for today," she said, though she continued looking directly at me rather than at her students. "Please remember to finish your arithmetic problems for tomorrow and bundle up warm for the walk home. Winter is coming early this year." The children began filing out of the classroom in an orderly fashion, passing within inches of where I stood in the hallway. As they walked by me, I could feel a slight chill in the air, as if each child were surrounded by a pocket of cold that moved with them. Some of the younger ones looked up at me with curious expressions, but none of them seemed surprised or frightened by my presence. One little girl, perhaps 8 years old with blonde braids and a red wool coat, stopped directly in front of me and tugged on my jacket sleeve. When I looked down at her, she smiled and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Are you our new teacher?" she asked. "Miss Anderson has been waiting for someone to help her with the upper grades. There are so many of us now, and we all want to learn." Before I could respond, the child continued walking toward the front door, joining the stream of students leaving the building. I followed them outside, watching as they scattered in different directions down the hill toward what had once been Chetina's residential neighborhoods. Some walked alone, others in small groups, all of them moving with the purposeful stride of children heading home after a normal day of school. The teacher, Miss Anderson, was the last to leave the building. She paused beside me on the front steps and looked out over the nearly empty town below us. "We have been waiting so long for the school to reopen," she said quietly. "The children miss their lessons terribly. They keep coming back, hoping that someday there will be teachers and books and proper classes again." She turned to face me directly, and I could see that her eyes held a deep sadness mixed with hope. "Will you stay and teach them?" she asked. "They have been without proper instruction for so many years. They deserve to finish their education, to learn everything they were meant to learn before." She paused, and the sadness in her eyes deepened. "Before the accident." I wanted to ask her what accident she was referring to, what had happened to these children and to her. But before I could form the words, she smiled one more time and walked down the hill in the same direction her students had gone. I watched until she disappeared around a corner, leaving me alone in front of the abandoned schoolhouse. When I returned the keys to Robert Steinberg that evening, I asked him about Miss Anderson and whether there had been any accidents involving the school during its years of operation. His expression grew somber, and he invited me inside his house for coffee and a conversation I would never forget. "Margaret Anderson taught here from 1952 to 1967, he told me, settling into an old recliner beside his wood-burning stove. "She was one of the best teachers we ever had, really cared about the kids and went out of her way to help families that were struggling. She never married, said the children were her family." Robert paused to sip his coffee, and I could see he was deciding how much to tell me. "The accident happened in February of 1967, he continued. "There was a terrible blizzard, worst storm anyone could remember. School should have been canceled, but the weather report had been wrong and it caught everyone by surprise. Miss Anderson kept all the children inside until the storm passed, but the building's heating system failed during the night. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. They found them the next morning when the storm cleared. All of them together in the main classroom, where Miss Anderson had gathered them around the piano to keep their spirits up. Carbon monoxide from a faulty chimney. 23 children and their teacher, all of them gone. I spent one more night in Katina, but I did not return to the schoolhouse. The next morning, as I was loading my car for the drive back to Anchorage, I heard the school bell ringing across the empty town. 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones, calling students to another day of learning that would never end. My job takes me to the most isolated communities in Alaska, places where getting supplies can mean the difference between life and death during the long winter months. My name is Ryan O'Malley, and I am 35 years old. For the past 8 years, I have worked as a supply chain manager for Northern Logistics, a company that specializes in delivering goods to remote villages, mining operations, and research stations throughout the state. It is demanding work that requires careful planning and an understanding of how quickly weather can turn a routine delivery into a survival situation. Most of my routes involve active communities with real people who depend on our deliveries for everything from food and medicine to fuel and equipment parts. But occasionally, I receive requests for deliveries to locations that exist more on paper than in reality. Places where someone still maintains a mailing address, even though the community itself has been abandoned for decades. That was the case with Elamar, a ghost town on Prince William Sound that had been a copper mining community from 1897 to 1919. According to my delivery manifest, someone at Elamar had ordered a substantial shipment of basic supplies, canned goods, batteries, medical supplies, and other items that would be essential for surviving an Alaska winter. The order was paid for in advance with a cashier's check that cleared without any problems. But when I tried to contact the customer by phone to arrange delivery details, the number was disconnected. Company policy required me to attempt delivery, even when customer contact was not possible. So I loaded my supply truck and headed for the coordinates provided on the shipping manifest. The drive to Elamar required taking the Seward Highway south from Anchorage, then following a series of increasingly remote roads toward the coast. The final approach was a narrow gravel track that had not seen maintenance in years, winding through dense forest before emerging at the shore of Prince William Sound. Elamar sits on a natural harbor that had been ideal for shipping copper ore to markets in the lower 48 states. During its peak years, the town had supported nearly 800 residents, with all the infrastructure necessary for a thriving mining community. Houses, businesses, a school, and most importantly, for my purposes, a company store that had served as the commercial center of the settlement. When I arrived in late October 2023, Elamar consisted of scattered building foundations, a few partially standing structures, and the skeletal remains of mining equipment that had been too expensive to remove when the copper ran out. Most of the original buildings had collapsed or been dismantled for salvage materials, but I could see one structure that appeared to be in relatively good condition. A 2-story wooden building with weathered siding and a hand-painted sign that read, Elamar Company Store. According to the shipping address on my manifest, this was where I needed to deliver the supplies I was carrying. The building looked abandoned like everything else in the ghost town, but my instructions were clear, and I had learned not to question the eccentricities of Alaska residents who chose to live in remote locations. I parked my truck in front of the store and began unloading boxes of supplies onto a hand truck. The front door of the building was closed, but not locked, opening with a loud creak when I pushed against it. Inside, I found myself in what appeared to be a perfectly preserved general store from the early 1900s, complete with wooden shelves, glass-fronted display cases, and a long counter with an old-fashioned cash register. The store still contained merchandise, though everything was covered with decades of dust and showed signs of age and neglect. There were bolts of fabric, hand tools, canned goods with labels I did not recognize, and various household items that would have been essential for frontier life. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of old wood and paper, and dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that streamed through dirty windows. I began stacking the supply boxes near the front counter, planning to leave them there with a delivery note since no one appeared to be present to sign for the shipment. That was when I heard footsteps coming from the back of the store, followed by a voice calling out in a friendly tone, "Just a moment. I will be right with you." A man emerged from what appeared to be a storage area behind the main counter. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a thick mustache typical of men from the early 20th century. He wore a white shirt with sleeve garters, dark pants held up by suspenders, and a leather apron that suggested he was the store's proprietor. What struck me most about his appearance was how clean and well-dressed he looked, as if he had just started his workday rather than spending decades in an abandoned building. "You must be from Northern Logistics," he said with a warm smile. "I have been expecting this delivery for quite some time. I hope you did not have any trouble finding us." I was confused by his comment about expecting the delivery for a long time, since the order had only been placed 2 weeks earlier. But I assumed he was referring to the challenges of getting supplies to such a remote location. I handed him the delivery manifest and waited while he reviewed the list of items I had brought. "This looks perfect," he said, nodding with satisfaction. "My customers have been asking for these items, and I was starting to worry that I would not be able to fulfill their orders before winter sets in." I looked around the empty store and wondered what customers he was referring to. But it was not my job to question how people chose to run their businesses. I helped him carry the supply boxes behind the counter, and he carefully arranged them on shelves and in storage areas with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been running a general store for many years. When we finished moving the supplies, the storekeeper reached into a wooden cash drawer and counted out payment for the delivery in cash. The bills were crisp and new, despite being of a design that had not been used for decades. I had seen enough old currency during my years in Alaska to recognize that these were genuine bills from the 1940s and 1950s, though they looked like they had been printed yesterday. "I appreciate you making the trip out here," he said as he handed me the money. "I know it is not easy to reach Elamar, especially this late in the season. My customers will be very pleased to see that I have restocked the shelves." As if summoned by his words, I heard the front door of the store open, followed by the sound of multiple people entering the building. I turned to see a group of men and women dressed in work clothes from the early 1900s, carrying shopping baskets and talking among themselves about items they needed to purchase. They appeared to be miners and their families, the kind of people who would have made up Elamar's population during its active years. The customers moved through the store with familiarity, selecting items from shelves and discussing prices with the storekeeper. They seemed solid and real, not translucent or obviously supernatural. But there was something about their presence that made the air in the store feel thick and charged with energy. As they shopped, they occasionally glanced at me with polite curiosity, but no one seemed surprised or concerned about my presence. One woman approached the counter carrying a selection of canned goods and fabric. She was perhaps 30 years old, wearing a simple dress and a shawl that suggested she was the wife of one of the miners. When she spoke to the storekeeper, her voice had an odd, echoing quality, as if it were coming from very far away. "Put this on the Murphy account," she said. "John will settle up on payday like always." The storekeeper nodded and made notations in a leather-bound ledger, recording the transaction in careful handwriting. As he worked, more customers continued to enter the store, creating a bustling atmosphere that would have been typical of a thriving frontier business. I watched this impossible scene for several minutes, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The logical part of my mind insisted that this had to be some kind of elaborate historical reenactment. But the customers were too numerous and too detailed for any amateur production. They moved and spoke with the natural ease of people going about their daily business, not performers following a script. The storekeeper finished serving his customers and walked back over to where I stood near the front counter. The shopping crowd gradually dispersed, with people leaving the store in small groups while discussing their purchases and making plans for the rest of their day. "Thank you again for the delivery," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that felt surprisingly cold. "I will be placing another order in a few weeks once I see how quickly these items sell. Business has been very good lately." I left the LMR company store in a state of confusion and disbelief, driving back toward Anchorage while trying to make sense of what I had experienced. The cash payment was real enough, sitting in my jacket pocket as physical proof that the transaction had occurred. But everything else about the delivery defied rational explanation. When I returned to the Northern Logistics office the next day, I submitted my delivery report as a successful completion, though I did not mention the unusual circumstances surrounding the customer or the other people I had encountered in the store. I also deposited the cash payment, which the bank accepted without question, despite the age of the bills. 2 weeks later, I received another order for delivery to LMR, placed by the same customer and paid for with another cashier's check that cleared without problems. This time, I made the delivery with a different driver, claiming that I needed to handle other routes that day. According to his report, the delivery went smoothly, though he did mention that the customer seemed unusually old-fashioned in his dress and manner of speaking. I have not returned to LMR since that October day, and I have requested that other drivers handle any future deliveries to that location. But I still think about the company store and wonder whether it continues to serve customers who have been shopping there for more than a century, conducting business transactions that somehow span the gap between the living world and whatever exists beyond it. I specialize in photographing abandoned places across the last frontier, documenting the remnants of Alaska's boom and bust cycles before they disappear entirely into the wilderness. My name is Zoe Kim, and I am 29 years old. For the past 6 years, I've been working as a documentary photographer, focusing on historical sites that tell the story of human ambition and failure in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. My work has been featured in National Geographic, Alaska magazine, and several museum exhibitions about frontier history. Photography in abandoned locations requires more than just technical skill with a camera. You need to understand the history of the places you visit, respect the memories embedded in decaying structures, and develop an intuition for finding the shots that capture not just what remains, but what has been lost. Some photographers hunt for dramatic lighting or unusual angles, but I have always been drawn to the subtler images that reveal the human stories behind abandoned places. That philosophy brought me to Latouche Island in September 2023, a remote location in Prince William Sound that had been the site of Alaska's largest copper mining operation during the early 1900s. At its peak, Latouche supported nearly 1,500 residents and produced millions of pounds of high-grade copper ore that was shipped to smelters in Tacoma, Washington. When the copper deposits were exhausted in the 1930s, the entire community was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind one of Alaska's most complete ghost towns. Accessing Latouche required chartering a small boat from Whittier, a 2-hour journey across often rough waters to reach the island's protected harbor. I had arranged for the boat captain to drop me off in the morning and return the following evening, giving me nearly 36 hours to explore and photograph the abandoned settlement. It was an expensive proposition, but the isolation meant that very few photographers had documented Latouche in recent years, and I was hoping to capture images that would complete a book project about Alaska's forgotten mining communities. The boat dropped me off at the ruins of what had once been a substantial pier, now reduced to scattered pilings and collapsed decking that jutted from the water like broken teeth. The harbor was eerily quiet, except for the sound of waves lapping against the rocky shoreline and the occasional cry of seabirds overhead. Behind the ruined pier, I could see the remains of Latouche spread across a natural amphitheater formed by low hills that rose from the water's edge. Most of the original buildings had collapsed or been dismantled for salvage materials, but enough structures remained to give a sense of what the community had been like during its active years. There were the foundations of dozens of houses, the skeletal frame of what had been the company store, and most impressively, the massive ruins of the copper processing mill that had been the economic heart of the operation. I spent the first few hours exploring the site and planning my photography approach. The late September light was perfect for the kind of atmospheric shots I wanted to capture, with low-angled sunlight filtering through the ruins and creating dramatic shadows across the abandoned landscape. I was particularly interested in photographing the mill ruins, which rose from the hillside like the skeleton of some enormous industrial beast. The mill had been built in stages over several decades, resulting in a complex structure of steel girders, concrete foundations, and massive machinery that had been too expensive to remove when the mine closed. Walking through the ruins was like exploring a three-dimensional puzzle, with walkways, platforms, and equipment arranged in patterns that had once made perfect sense to the engineers who designed them. I was setting up for a shot of the mill's main processing floor when I first noticed something unusual in my camera's viewfinder. Through the lens, I could see what appeared to be a human figure standing among the machinery, partially obscured by shadows and twisted metal. When I lowered the camera to look directly at the area, there was no one there. I assumed it must have been a trick of the light, or perhaps a piece of equipment that had looked human-shaped when viewed from a certain angle. But when I raised the camera again, the figure was still visible through the viewfinder, and this time I could see more details. It appeared to be a man wearing work clothes typical of the early 1900s, heavy canvas pants, a wool shirt, and a leather cap with a miner's lamp attached to the front. I took several photographs of the area, thinking that even if the figure was some kind of optical illusion, it might create an interesting artistic effect in the final images. But each time I looked through the viewfinder, I could see the worker clearly, while direct observation revealed only empty ruins and abandoned machinery. As I continued photographing the mill complex, I began seeing more figures through my camera lens. They appeared to be miners and mill workers going about their daily tasks, operating equipment, carrying tools, and moving through the ruins with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew their jobs well. Some were more distinct than others, but all of them shared the same translucent quality that made them visible only through the camera's viewfinder. By late afternoon, I had documented at least 20 different figures working throughout the mill ruins. Some appeared to be alone, focused on specific tasks, while others worked in small groups that seemed to be coordinating their activities. What struck me most about these phantom workers was how natural and unstaged their movements appeared. They were not performing for my camera or trying to communicate with me. They were simply continuing the work they had done in life, unaware that the mill had been abandoned for nearly 90 years. The most compelling figure I encountered was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s. wearing a long skirt and white blouse that suggested she worked in an office rather than on the processing floor. Through my camera lens, I could see her moving between different areas of the mill, carrying what looked like paperwork and occasionally stopping to speak with the other workers. She had an air of authority that suggested she might have been a supervisor or administrator. When I focused my telephoto lens on her face, she looked directly into the camera with an expression of mild curiosity, as if she could sense my presence but was not quite sure what to make of it. Her eyes held an intelligence and warmth that made her seem completely real and human, despite the fact that she was invisible to my naked eye. I spent nearly an hour photographing this woman as she moved through her ghostly duties, documenting what appeared to be a typical workday in the Latouche mill circa 1920. She seemed to be conducting some kind of inspection or quality control process, examining equipment and taking notes in a leather-bound ledger that she carried with her. At one point, she approached very close to where I was standing and appeared to look directly at me through the camera lens. When she spoke, I could not hear her voice, but I could read her lips clearly as she mouthed the words, "Are you documenting our work?" I nodded instinctively, though I realized she probably could not see me any more clearly than I could see her without the camera. But she seemed to understand my response, because she smiled and gestured for me to follow her to a different area of the mill. She led me to what had been the administrative offices, a section of the mill where wooden structures had been built within the larger steel framework. Through my camera, I could see that this area was fully furnished and operational, with desks, filing cabinets, and office equipment that would have been state-of-the-art in the early 1900s. Several people were working at the desks, processing paperwork and conducting business related to the mill's operations. The woman who had led me there pointed to a large chart on the wall that showed production figures and shipping schedules. Through my telephoto lens, I could read the dates clearly. They were all from 1927, the peak year of production at Latouche. She seemed to want me to understand that I was witnessing the mill during its most successful period, when the copper ore was flowing freely and the community was thriving. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruins, the phantom workers gradually became more difficult to see, even through my camera lens. The figures grew fainter and more translucent, until they were little more than suggestions of movement in the gathering darkness. By full dark, they had disappeared entirely, leaving me alone among the silent ruins. I spent the night camped near the harbor, and the next morning, I continued photographing other areas of the abandoned settlement. But the phantom workers had vanished with the daylight, and my camera showed only empty buildings and rusted equipment. When I returned to Anchorage and developed the digital images from Latouche, I expected to find that the figures I had seen through my viewfinder would not appear in the final photographs. But to my amazement, they were all there. Dozens of ghostly workers captured in various poses and activities throughout the mill complex. The images were subtle and could easily be dismissed as photographic artifacts or processing errors. But I knew what I had witnessed. The most remarkable photograph was the one I had taken of the administrative offices. In the final image, I could see the woman who had led me there sitting at her desk, apparently working on paperwork related to the mill's operations. But more importantly, I could see the production chart on the wall behind her, with all the dates and figures clearly readable. When I researched the historical records of Latouche's mining operations, I found that the production figures shown in my photograph matched exactly with the documented output for 1927. There was no way I could have known these specific numbers before taking the pictures, and the level of detail visible in the phantom office was far beyond anything that could have been fabricated or imagined. I have included several of the Latouche photographs in museum exhibitions, though I never mention the supernatural circumstances under which they were taken. Viewers sometimes comment on the atmospheric quality of the images or ask about my digital manipulation techniques, not realizing that they are looking at genuine documentary photographs of people who died nearly a century ago. The experience at Latouche changed my approach to photographing abandoned places. I now understand that my camera can capture more than just physical ruins. It can document the memories and energies that linger in places where human dreams were built and ultimately abandoned. Some locations retain the imprints of the people who lived and worked there. And under the right circumstances, those imprints can be photographed and preserved. I have returned to Latouche twice since that first visit, but I have never again seen the phantom workers through my camera lens. Perhaps they only appear to photographers who approach their former workplace with the right combination of respect and curiosity. Or perhaps that single day in September 2023 was a unique moment when the barriers between past and present became temporarily transparent, allowing me to document a day in the life of a community that officially ceased to exist in 1930. The photographs remain as proof of what I witnessed, tangible evidence that some places never truly become abandoned as long as the memories of human activity continue to echo through their empty spaces. Someone has to look after these forgotten places to ensure that history does not simply vanish into the wilderness without leaving any trace of the dreams and struggles that once filled these empty buildings. My name is Samuel Blackwood, and I am 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I have worked as a historical preservationist for the Alaska Heritage Foundation, maintaining and protecting abandoned settlements that have significant cultural or historical value. It is solitary work that requires spending weeks or months alone in remote locations, but I have never minded the isolation. These ghost towns have stories to tell, and I consider myself their guardian and interpreter. The town of Iditarod holds a special place in Alaska's history as the original terminus of the famous dog sled trail that bears its name. Founded in 1910 during a gold rush that brought thousands of prospectors to the remote interior, Iditarod grew quickly into a substantial community with hotels, saloons, stores, and all the infrastructure necessary to support a thriving mining district. At its peak, nearly 10,000 people called Iditarod home, making it one of Alaska's largest settlements outside of the major coastal cities. But like so many boom towns, Iditarod's prosperity was built on a finite resource. When the easily accessible gold deposits were exhausted by the early 1920s, the population began to decline rapidly. The final blow came in 1929, when a devastating fire destroyed most of the town's commercial district. Rather than rebuild, most residents simply abandoned their homes and businesses, leaving Iditarod to slowly decay in the harsh interior climate. Today, Iditarod exists as a scattered collection of building foundations, collapsed structures, and a handful of buildings that have somehow survived nearly a century of abandonment. The Alaska Heritage Foundation designated it as a protected historical site in 1998, recognizing its importance to the state's mining heritage and its connection to the Iditarod Trail Sled Dog Race that commemorates the original supply route to the goldfields. My assignment was to spend the winter of 2023 to 2024 in Iditarod, conducting a comprehensive survey of the remaining structures and developing a long-term preservation plan for the most historically significant buildings. It would be my first extended stay in the ghost town, though I had visited several times during summer surveys. Winter preservation work is challenging but necessary, as the extreme cold and snow loads reveal structural problems that are not apparent during warmer months. I arrived in Iditarod in early November 2023, flying in by bush plane and landing on a frozen lake about 2 miles from the town site. My supplies included everything necessary for a 4-month solo stay. A portable generator, heating fuel, preserved food, communication equipment, and specialized tools for documenting and stabilizing historical structures. I had also brought extensive research materials about Iditarod's history, hoping to correlate my physical findings with historical records and photographs. My base camp was established in one of the few buildings still substantial enough to provide adequate shelter. A 2-story structure that had originally served as a boarding house for miners. The building required significant temporary repairs to make it habitable, including patching holes in the roof and installing a wood-burning stove for heat, but it provided the secure workspace I needed for the extended project. The first few weeks passed uneventfully as I settled into the routine of winter preservation work. Days were short during the Alaska winter, providing only a few hours of usable daylight for outdoor surveys. But the long evenings gave me time to organize my findings and cross-reference them with historical documents. The isolation was complete, but not unpleasant. I had always found solace in the silence of abandoned places. It was during my 3rd week in Iditarod that I first noticed signs of other human presence in the ghost town. I began finding footprints in the snow around the buildings I was surveying. Fresh tracks that appeared overnight and followed no logical pattern. The prints were made by boots typical of early 20th century workwear, with distinctive heel and sole patterns that matched footwear from the town's active period. At first, I assumed the tracks were being made by other researchers, or perhaps local residents who had legitimate reasons for visiting the historical site. But when I attempted to follow the trails, they invariably led to areas where continuing would be impossible. The middle of collapsed buildings, the edges of deep ravines, or simply dead ends, where the tracks stopped abruptly without any sign of the person turning around or leaving by another route. More disturbing was the discovery that the footprints appeared to be made by multiple individuals moving through the ghost town simultaneously. I could identify at least 6 different boot patterns, suggesting a group of people who were conducting their own survey or exploration of the site. But despite setting up motion-activated cameras and maintaining careful watch during the brief daylight hours, I never saw any living person in Iditarod other than myself. The footprints were accompanied by other signs of activity that could not be easily explained. I would arrive at buildings in the morning to find doors that had been securely closed the previous evening standing wide open, with no evidence of forced entry or structural failure. Tools and equipment that I had carefully organized would be rearranged in different patterns, always in ways that suggested someone had been using them for construction or repair work. Most unsettling of all were the sounds that began occurring during the long winter nights. I would hear hammering, sawing, and the creaking of timber that suggested active construction work somewhere in the town. The sounds were too regular and purposeful to be caused by wind or settling structures, and they always seemed to come from areas where I knew no substantial buildings remained standing. One particularly clear night in December, I decided to investigate the source of these construction sounds directly. Armed with a powerful flashlight and wearing my heaviest winter gear, I left my boarding house shelter and followed the sounds toward what had been Iditarod's main commercial district. The temperature was nearly 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to make extended outdoor activity dangerous. But I was determined to solve the mystery of who or what was working in the ghost town after dark. The sounds led me to the foundation of what historical records indicated had been the town's largest hotel, a 3-story structure that had burned in the 1929 fire. Nothing remained above ground level except scattered stones and twisted metal fixtures. But the sounds of construction work were clearly coming from this location. When I approached the foundation and shined my flashlight into the excavated area, I saw something that challenged every assumption I had about the nature of historical preservation work. the hotel was being rebuilt. Not by living people using modern construction techniques, but by translucent figures wearing the work clothes and using the hand tools typical of early 20th century construction crews. I could see at least a dozen men working with purposeful efficiency to reconstruct the hotel's timber frame, raising walls and installing roof beams with the practiced coordination of experienced builders. The Phantom construction crew appeared solid enough to handle heavy timber and operate hand tools, but I could see through them to the frozen ground beneath their feet. They worked without speaking, communicating through gestures and expressions that suggested they had performed these same tasks countless times before. Their movements had the fluid precision of people who knew their trade thoroughly and took pride in their craftsmanship. As I watched this impossible scene, one of the workers looked up from his task and made direct eye contact with me. He was a man in his 40s, with a thick beard and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors in harsh conditions. When he saw me watching, he smiled and touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of acknowledgement, then returned to his work as if my presence was expected and welcome. I stood at the edge of the foundation for what felt like hours, documenting this supernatural construction project with my camera and taking detailed notes about what I was witnessing. The Phantom workers continued their tasks without pause, gradually rebuilding portions of the hotel that had been destroyed nearly a century earlier. Their work followed the original architectural plans perfectly, as if they were drawing on memories of the building's construction during Iditarod's boom years. As dawn approached and the first light of the short winter day began to illuminate the ghost town, the Phantom construction crew gradually faded away, leaving behind no physical evidence of their nighttime labors. The hotel foundation remained as empty and ruined as it had been when I first arrived in Iditarod, but the experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of what historical preservation means in a place like this. I realized that I was not alone in Iditarod, and that my role as caretaker was being shared with the spirits of people who had built this community and were unwilling to let it disappear completely from the world. Over the remaining months of my winter assignment, I continued to witness the Phantom construction crews working throughout the ghost town. Different groups appeared to be responsible for different buildings. Each crew focused on reconstructing the structures they had originally built during Iditarod's active years. They worked only at night and only during the coldest months, as if the extreme conditions somehow made it easier for them to manifest in the physical world. I began to understand that these spirits were not haunting Iditarod in the traditional sense of being trapped or tormented by their past. Instead, they were continuing the work they had done in life, maintaining and rebuilding their community with the same dedication they had shown as living people. They were the original preservationists, refusing to allow their town to fade into complete oblivion. My final report to the Alaska Heritage Foundation focused on the conventional aspects of structural assessment and preservation recommendations, but I included a separate confidential addendum documenting the supernatural construction activities I had witnessed. I recommended that Iditarod be maintained as a protected site, not just for its historical significance, but as recognition that some places retain the active presence of the people who created them. The Foundation accepted my preservation recommendations and has continued to support minimal maintenance work at Iditarod, though they have never commented officially on my supernatural observations. But I know that other caretakers who have spent extended time at the site have reported similar experiences. And there is an unspoken understanding among historical preservationists that some locations require protection, not just of their physical remains, but of the memories and spirits that continue to inhabit them. I have returned to Iditarod several times since that winter assignment, always during the coldest months when the Phantom construction crews are most active. They have come to accept my presence as part of their ongoing work, occasionally acknowledging me with nods or gestures, but never interfering with my preservation activities. We are partners in the same mission, ensuring that Iditarod and its stories survive for future generations to discover and appreciate. The ghost town continues to decay slowly under the assault of weather and time, but it will never be truly abandoned as long as its original builders continue their eternal construction project, rebuilding their community one ghostly timber at a time. Metal detecting in ghost towns has always been my weekend escape, a way to combine my professional interest in geology with the thrill of discovering artifacts that tell the stories of Alaska's mining past. My name is Ashley Martinez, and I am 33 years old. I work as a geological survey technician for the state, spending most weekdays analyzing soil samples and mineral compositions in laboratory settings. But when Saturday arrives, I pack my metal detector and head for the wilderness, searching through abandoned settlements for the small treasures that previous inhabitants left behind. Most of my finds are common items: nails, coins, pieces of mining equipment, and household objects that were lost or discarded during the daily life of frontier communities. Occasionally, I discover something more significant: a gold nugget, a piece of vintage jewelry, or a tool with historical significance that ends up in a museum collection. But it was the discovery of an old prospector's map that led me into the most terrifying experience of my life. I found the map in August 2023 while exploring the ruins of Chisana, a gold rush town near the Canadian border that had flourished briefly between 1913 and 1915. Chisana was unusual among Alaska boom towns because its gold deposits were discovered so late in the territorial period, creating what some historians call the last great gold rush in North America. At its peak, Chisana supported nearly 5,000 residents, making it temporarily one of Alaska's largest communities. Like most boom towns, Chisana's prosperity was short-lived. The easily accessible gold was quickly exhausted, and by 1916 the population had dwindled to fewer than 100 people. Today, Chisana exists as a collection of collapsed cabins and scattered debris in a remote valley, accessible only by small aircraft or extremely challenging overland travel. The map was hidden inside a rusted coffee tin that I discovered buried beneath the floorboards of what had been a miner's cabin. The tin also contained a few gold coins, some personal letters, and a collection of assaying tools that suggested the cabin's owner had been involved in evaluating ore samples for other prospectors. But it was the hand-drawn map that captured my attention immediately. The map showed the Chisana area in remarkable detail, with topographical features, creek locations, and elevation markers drawn with the precision of a professional surveyor. But more importantly, it was covered with notations indicating potential gold deposits, including several areas marked with symbols that clearly indicated significant discoveries. The map was signed and dated Samuel Kowalski, September 1914. I had studied enough Alaska mining history to know that 1914 was the peak year of gold production in the Chisana district. If this map was genuine, it represented a first-hand account of gold discoveries made during the height of the rush. Even if the marked locations had been exhausted decades ago, the map would have significant historical value as a primary source document about early 20th century prospecting techniques. But what made the map truly intriguing were the notations written in red ink around one particular creek drainage. Unlike the other markings, which were clearly related to gold deposits, these red annotations included warnings: "Do not dig here after dark," "Strange sounds from underground," and most ominously, "Johnson and Miller disappeared October 15th. Avoid this area." My scientific training made me skeptical of supernatural explanations for mining accidents. But I was curious enough about the geological features of the marked area to plan a follow-up expedition. The drainage indicated on the map was about 5 miles from the main Chisana town site, accessible by a challenging hike through rough terrain, but potentially rich in both historical artifacts and mineral samples. I returned to Chisana 2 weeks later, equipped with camping gear for a 3-day expedition and metal detecting equipment suitable for more extensive searching. The weather was perfect for late August, with clear skies and temperatures that would remain comfortable for sleeping outdoors. I planned to spend the first day hiking to the creek drainage marked on the map, establish a base camp, and then spend 2 full days systematically searching the area for both artifacts and geological samples. The hike to the creek drainage was more difficult than I had anticipated, requiring navigation through dense brush and across unstable terrain that showed evidence of previous mining activity. When I finally reached the area indicated on Samuel Kowalski's map, I found clear signs that it had been the site of extensive gold prospecting. Hand-dug test pits, the remains of sluice boxes, and scattered equipment that had been abandoned when the miners moved on to more promising locations. I established my camp near a grove of spruce trees that provided shelter and a good view of the creek valley. The setting was beautiful, but eerily quiet, with none of the wildlife sounds that usually fill Alaska's wilderness areas. Even during the brief twilight that passes for night during Alaska's late summer, the silence was complete and somehow oppressive. I began my metal detecting survey the next morning, working systematically along the creek bed and through the areas where previous miners had concentrated their efforts. The detector immediately began registering hits, and within the first few hours, I had recovered several coins, pieces of mining equipment, and what appeared to be personal items that had been lost or abandoned during the original prospecting activities. But as the day progressed, I began finding objects that did not fit the pattern of typical mining artifacts. There were pieces of clothing buried in the gravel, far more than would be expected from normal wear and replacement. I found several pairs of boots, all of them showing signs of hasty removal rather than normal abandonment. Most disturbing were the personal items: pocket watches, wedding rings, and photographs that appeared to have been dropped rather than deliberately discarded. It was while excavating around a particularly strong metal detector signal that I made the discovery that changed everything. About 3 feet down in what had been a test pit dug by the original miners, I found human bones. My geological training included enough forensic knowledge to recognize that these were not ancient remains or the result of natural deaths. The bones showed evidence of trauma, and they were scattered in a pattern that suggested the bodies had been torn apart by some tremendous force. More disturbing was the number of individual skeletons represented by the bone fragments I was uncovering. This was not a single mining accident, but evidence of multiple violent deaths. I should have stopped digging and contacted the authorities immediately. But my scientific curiosity overcame my better judgment. I wanted to understand what had happened in this remote creek valley that had prompted Samuel Kowalski to mark his map with warnings about disappearances and strange sounds. As I continued excavating, I found more evidence of violent deaths: shredded clothing, broken tools, and personal effects scattered as if their owners had been attacked while working. The pattern of bone distribution suggested that whatever had killed these miners had also partially consumed their remains, leaving behind only fragments that had been buried by decades of creek flooding and sediment deposition. The sun was beginning to set by the time I realized how much I had uncovered and how far I had strayed from normal archaeological protocols. I had excavated an area nearly 10 feet square and 3 feet deep, revealing what was clearly a mass grave containing the remains of at least 6 different individuals. The implications were staggering. This was evidence of a historical atrocity that had been hidden in the Alaska wilderness for more than a century. I was photographing the excavation site and preparing to cover it for the night when I heard the sound that Samuel Kowalski had warned about on his map. Strange noises coming from underground. It began as a low rumbling, like distant thunder or the sound of heavy machinery operating far below the surface. But gradually, the rumbling resolved into something more disturbing. The sound of digging, as if something large and powerful were excavating tunnels beneath the creek bed. The digging sounds were accompanied by what could only be described as breathing, deep and rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that suggested something enormous was moving through underground passages. As darkness fell completely, the underground sounds grew louder and more active. I could hear what sounded like multiple creatures moving through an extensive tunnel system, occasionally breaking the surface to gulp air before diving back into their subterranean domain. Whatever was down there was large enough to displace significant amounts of earth and gravel, creating vibrations that I could feel through the soles of my boots. I retreated to my campsite and tried to convince myself that I was hearing natural geological phenomena, underground streams, settling permafrost, or gas escaping from decomposing organic matter. But the sounds were too purposeful, too obviously biological to be explained by non-living processes. Around midnight, something began emerging from the excavation site. I first noticed movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes rising from the pit I had dug during the day. When I focused my flashlight on the area, I saw creatures that defied every principle of biology and zoology I understood. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but far larger than any person, with elongated limbs that ended in claws capable of moving tons of earth and rock. Their skin appeared to be adapted for underground living, pale and translucent enough that I could see the movement of internal organs beneath the surface. But most horrifying were their faces, which retained enough human characteristics to suggest that these creatures had once been people. The miners who had disappeared in 1914 had not been killed by these underground dwellers. They had been transformed into them, changed by some process that preserved their essential humanity while adapting them for a subterranean existence. The creatures showed no immediate hostility toward me, but they were clearly reclaiming the excavation site I had disturbed. Using their massive claws, they began refilling the pit with remarkable speed and efficiency, carefully reburying the bone fragments and artifacts I had uncovered. They worked with the coordinated purpose of people who understood the importance of keeping their secrets hidden. One of the creatures paused in its work and looked directly at me across the campsite. In its face, I could see traces of what had once been human intelligence and emotion. When it spoke, its voice was distorted by physical changes, but still recognizably that of a person who had once lived and worked above ground. "You should not have dug here," it said, echoing the warning Samuel Kowalski had written on his map. "Some gold comes at too high a price." I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, listening to the sounds of the creatures working to erase all evidence of my excavation. By dawn, they had disappeared back into their underground realm, leaving the creek valley exactly as I had found it. Even my metal detector could no longer locate the artifacts I had uncovered the previous day. I hiked back to Chisana that morning and flew out to Fairbanks on the first available charter flight, taking Samuel Kowalski's map with me as the only proof of what I had discovered. I have never returned to that creek drainage, and I have never reported the location of the mass grave to authorities. Some secrets are meant to remain buried, protected by guardians who have paid the ultimate price for disturbing forces that should be left alone. The prospector's map remains in my possession, a reminder that Alaska's gold rush history includes chapters that were never meant to be written in official records. Somewhere in the remote valleys near Chisana, the transformed miners continue their eternal vigil, ensuring that the price they paid for their greed remains hidden beneath the earth.